Good morning to everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion as part of our virtual event series at the Responsible AI Institute. My name is Rasa Drukarc. I am the Director of Policy and Delivery at the RAI Institute, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's session, which will focus on the role of procurement in shaping responsible AI and vice versa. Now, before we head into the introductions of the wonderful lineup of panelists that we have today, I just want to give a little bit of background before I hand over the mic to the three of you. So, and I'm sure it's not a surprise to anyone that I'm going to be saying this, but AI is revolutionizing industries. Now, that's no surprise, I know, but the interesting part is that currently almost 80% of companies globally are either using artificial intelligence or they are thinking about its use. And with most of those companies relying almost exclusively on external vendors to adopt AI, the question is, how do you do so responsibly? Now, based on their purchasing power, they can impact the way in which these technologies are A, developed, and B, are used. And that's exactly what we're going to be focusing on in this panel discussion, again, on the role of procurement in developing responsible AI and vice versa. I want to take this opportunity now to hand the mic over to our wonderful panelists. We have Dr. Carrie Miller from the AI Procurement Lab and Center for Inclusive Change. We have Yukun Zhang from ATP Financial, and we have Harry Chambers from OneTrust, both valued member organizations of the Responsible AI Institute. I'm going to hand the mic on to you, maybe starting with you, Carrie, and then I will shift through both of you, Harry and Yukun.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for hosting this particular session. We're going to talk a lot about procurement today. It is, to me, one of the cornerstones of governance for AI. So I've been researching procurement for a long time, and particularly how to look into the supply chain. And so there's some fascinating things we need to pay attention to. And so we just founded a nonprofit called the AI Procurement Lab, hopefully to help upskill not just procurement managers, but anybody that comes into contact with trying to set requirements and deploy these technologies. So thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Definitely excited to have you on board and excited to have this conversation. I'll move to you, Yukun. Feel free to introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to join this panel today. My name is Yukun Zhang, and I lead the AI governance and responsible AI work at ATP Financial. ATP is a leading financial industry, financial institutions started in Alberta, Canada, and we focus on put people first. I've been very lucky that I've been leading the AI governance work for the past almost 8 years now, and I've seen a lot of shifts in the field of AI governance. I look at AI governance in a holistic way, but I also see procurement is getting more and more attention in the past year. And also I see that's the biggest gap in a lot of financial institutions and other industry as well. So I'm very happy that I can join this discussion today. And nice to meet you, everyone.
Thank you, Yukun. And definitely the people-centric or human-centric approach is, I think, key to what we're seeing in AI governance now as well. Last but definitely not least, Harry, on to you.
Hi, Adasa. Thank you for the fantastic intro. Hi, everyone. My name's Harry Chambers. I'm a senior privacy analyst at OneTrust, specifically OneTrust Data Guidance as part of the regulatory intelligence team. My role there is that I'm responsible for drafting guidance notes, insight articles, and then also a lot of the internal tools at OneTrust relating to data privacy, but also, of course, artificial intelligence as well. Catching up with today's discussion, namely AI procurement and any latest development in AI legislative change.
Thank you so much, Harry. And I said last, but definitely not least, and that's why I'm also starting with you, to better understand the kind of like the landscape of challenges that we are facing. Because in order to understand how we govern AI properly and make sure that it's trustworthy and responsible, we kind of need to take a step back and understand what are some of the problems that we're facing in order to solve them. So I want to kick off by asking you if you can maybe map some of the challenges in AI procurement that organizations are facing today, and organizations in the broadest sense. So it can be from private companies all the way down to government organizations, but I'm curious to hear more about those challenges.
Sure. So firstly, for anyone that's watching this panel today, these challenges, I'm sure you may have encountered them, but fortunately, you're not alone. Government organizations and policymakers have been very active in trying to map out what some of these challenges when it comes to AI or responsible AI procurement. This is something that was taken on board in the US, for example, by the Office of Management and Budget, which has already sent out a request for information on responsible procurement of AI for government agencies and departments. In doing so, and widely from what I've encountered as well, some of the issues that come to AI procurement include, starting off with, we just have the market availability of vendors in the first place. A lot of organizations will be sourcing their AI vendors from a particular few organizations. The particular issue here being that a lot of organizations, legislation or standards or framework that say may deal with the regulation of AI or procurement of responsible AI specifically, will deal with AI before it's actually been procured. A lot of organizations will already be using an AI tool or have a contract with an organization that has an AI tool in the first place. So we have a particular issue here potentially of vendor lock-in. Organizations may be using a proprietary technology already, a particular format that then map out to the wider use of software, and it may be used as part of a larger or monolithic system. And this just makes it a bit of an issue already changing from a particular AI system, particularly if it represents a particular issue. If there are any issues sourced with the type of data within this within an AI model as well. This is also something that's been noticed by, in the US again, the US Department of the Treasury, which has noted out a particular issue for organizations in that there may be a bit of a skills gap between organizations that are actually trying to use AI tools. If they're choosing, say, if they're a particular vendor, a particular AI product, they may not even be sure what to look for in the first place. Alongside this, obviously, there are organizations that may have an extensive risk team, but a lot of organizations, particularly smaller ones, won't have much of a risk team. They won't be able to spend an extensive amount of time looking at different sources and different vendors as well, regardless of the fact that they may already be in a contract with a vendor that has an AI product already, and thus restricting their choices. Now, obviously, there are also particular issues relating to AI procurement, but there are the general ones, and you sort of touched on that, Hadassah, in your question as well, that relate to AI overall. So we need to make sure that the use of AI is safe, trustworthy, and then also enabling rights protecting outcomes before we even put that AI model into use. And these issues or these requirements should apply to AI vendors alongside the organizations that are then actually planning to deploy them. In terms of actually mitigating this, there are a particular range of assessments that we can conduct in the AI procurement process. So we can raise interesting questions when it comes to AI procurement on actually using a vendor, or if we have the capability on developing an AI model in-house, alongside actually the identity or the relationship and between vendors and organizations, and then what the responsibilities are between, say, a vendor and an organization as well. There are also particular challenges that we should note as well. So bias is an issue tossed around with AI, but also particularly salient when it comes to AI procurement. We also have requirements relating to algorithmic discrimination. And now the interesting thing about, say, these particular two issues of bias and algorithmic discrimination is that although they are in some jurisdictions more of a recommendation, less so than a legislative requirement, there are already legislative requirements. For instance, if you're working in any regulatory circle relating to AI, unless you've been sleeping under a rock, you'll have known about the EU AI Act, but also at the smaller scale as well. So for instance, in the US already, we have New York City Local Law 144, which relates to the use of AI in requiring bias audits to be conducted. And that relates specifically to the use of automated employment decision-making. So we already have legislative requirements presenting another challenge before we even have acquired an AI tool.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that those are really interesting points that you kind of like indicated there. It's like you, rather than looking at the challenges, you really mapped like the landscape, and there are a lot of elements that we need to unpack in that. And one of the things, I know that you probably have a bit more that you want to explain about these regulatory frameworks. I think that it would be really interesting to unpack that. But before we do that, I'm curious, you mentioned like this landscape of assessment, the potential to assess risks or the obligation to assess risks in procurement. You mentioned the difference between developing and then procuring or deploying. Carrie, can you maybe kind of follow up on the points that Harry made and discuss what this assessment landscape looks like, how you actually assess those risks along what you just also named the supply chain, and how you ensure that you put in place a system of which you know where the pitfalls may potentially lie. Absolutely.
And congratulations to Harry for giving us a mic drop right out of the gate. Thank you. So we, my partner and I developed a risk management framework for procuring AI systems, but it's modeled after traditional risk management frameworks. And so what we like to suggest is that you begin at the beginning. You have to start where you're going to establish the requirements. First of all, you need to start with a legitimate business purpose and not be fooled by, someone waltzing into the office saying, look at this shiny new technology. Don't you need this? And you feel like fear of missing out. You must have it. So it needs to be grounded in a legitimate need with kind of a rigorous review of why the problem exists, because that decides and drives how you shape your need, right? And so once you have that in place, you can develop awareness when you develop the solicitation. And so having that awareness in the solicitation helps you not set yourself up for the risks to begin with. So if you know who your target audience is, who the users will be, what their vulnerabilities are, and you start thinking through the risks up front, you can head them off a little bit before you even get into accepting bid proposals. Once you get into the bid proposal stage, what's really important is, as a buyer, it's not necessarily about your framework at that point. It's about the supplier's risk management framework. What did they apply to their processes? Did they follow NIST? Did they follow COSO? Did they follow some other risk management framework that's very relevant to their industry? If they're if they're in energy, there are specific frameworks for energy and risk management in that sector. So that's where you want to interrogate kind of in the bid process. But while you're doing that, we also suggest keeping a register of risks a risk register as you're going through for each supplier. This one didn't seem right. Here in this supplier, I didn't quite like this. No one's going to be perfect. So you're going to keep your risk register, but while you're doing the risk register, you're going to do mapping. So this is following the NIST framework. So you're going to map your risks to mitigations during that process. And you're going to need that because when you get to the contract, you're going to need those mitigations to bake into that contract because, again, no one's going to be perfect. You put those mitigations in the contract and you negotiate over them. It has to be fair. And you deal with the mitigations there and make them measurable, please. Make them measurable, time-bound, metrics-based, KPIs if you can. Because when you finalize that contract and you get into monitoring, that's what monitoring is going to be based on, everything you just said in the contract. And don't forget in the contract, this is one of the more important pieces I find people are missing, that trigger whenever something is breached. So let's say you tolerate a certain amount of oopsies. We don't like too many of them, but they happen. But if there's too many of them, there should be a kill switch, right? That needs to be in the contract too. Everybody needs to be on notice of what's going to happen if too many of these things happen. And so that's what monitoring is going to look like. So it's not brain surgery, but you just have to do the do, right?
Yeah, so it's really knowing what you're working with, right?
Yeah.
And what you're working towards. You can, from an operational perspective, because you're at ATB Financial, I can imagine that you are directly working within these processes of procurement. Listening to what Carrie said, listening to what Harry has said, can you maybe touch upon what this looks like from an operational perspective? Like, how do you actually work with this in practice at the moment?
Thanks. Carrie, I think you made a lot of great points. I was actually taking notes and I'm going to compare our processes. I think what I want to mention, what we are seeing right now, especially in the past 6 months, is there are not only new vendors, but also existing vendors that we use. They are enabling AI features or even Gen AI features. So I see for us, the most important thing is education. So within the organization, we need to let teams know that, for example, you've been using Tableau and they're adding those AI features. And maybe for some of the teams, they're not aware of the risks of using that additional AI features. They'll just use it because it's already an existing vendor. I'm not saying specifically for that example. I'm saying that in general, a lot of vendors, they enable AI features, what it means to us. We need to evaluate the risk of enabling that AI feature. Should we opt in or opt out of that feature? So that's one important thing that we've been training our team member about is first we need to identify those vendors, existing vendors that are using new AI features, and need to go through our process, the same process for the new vendors, because we need to understand the risks of using that additional AI features. And also, like Carrie said, what are the risk mapping? And we need to monitor those risks. So the training piece has been very helpful because it's helping our whole ecosystem, risk management ecosystem, understand the importance of monitoring those new AI capabilities of existing vendors. For new vendors, we have a series of process that we follow. And ATB being one of the financial institutions, we have a relatively mature risk assessment team, risk management team. We have 3 lines of defense. We have different kinds of processes that we evaluate vendors. So those are something that we've been using both internal developed models, also for vendor purchased AI products. And the third thing is, I think, collaboration and a cross-functional team. It has been very important for us. We have people from legal, from security, from ethics, from compliance, and from the AI team and procurement team. We work together when evaluate the risk. And I think the most important thing is sometimes Harry mentioned vendor lock-in risk. There are also other risks because you can only select those that's in the market. So for us as a company, sometimes it's passive because you can only choose that much and you can only do that much. For example, in the contractual language. So it's important to understand the risk and make sure that according to your risk tolerance, your company can accept this level of risk and make sure you're monitoring it. So those are something that we've been doing. I'm not saying it's perfect. We're improving it over time. Also see the challenges shift over time as well. So we have a very adaptive framework that, and also with the cross-functional team, we can adapt as things evolve.
Thank you, Yukon. And indeed, like responsible AI and AI governance in general is a journey. But I think the leadership that you're showing is very admirable. And I want to touch upon one specific point that you made, and that is in relation to those organizations that you're already collaborating with, those that are providing you with certain systems and functionalities, and then they decide to add on top of that AI functionalities. Like I mentioned in the introduction, a lot of companies are considering the use or are already using or are considering using AI. So it's unimaginable that that you'd be working with organizations that are not using AI somewhere or another. But I wanted to move it briefly to you, Carrie, again, and understand from you and your perspective and your work, how do you start that conversation once you, because these systems are already in your organization. There's no prior assessment because that has kind of already taken place, and internally employees may decide or other stakeholders may decide to interact. How do you have that discussion, and where do you really start with that?
I mean, it is a very common problem. I think everyone is struggling with this issue at large, and it requires some discipline from companies or organizations in general. First of all, you have to know, you have to do an audit. You have to understand where are all your systems? What are they? You have to read through the privacy policies. You have to read through the terms and conditions. You really do need to understand that, and you need to know who the business owners are of each one of those. And then you have to do the due diligence of either going back, if it's an important enough system to your business operations, you really do need to go back to them and say, look, we're going to need to modify your contract either at the renewal stage or prior to say, we need to reserve the right to review what you're doing to, before you implement a change like that. We want to interrogate some of the features, some of the questions, what the data is that you're collecting, why, you have the right to do that, especially if it's part of a pretty significant business operation that could, hinder you later down the road.
Thanks, indeed. And I wonder, Harry, you at OneTrust, working with the kind of like the processes and the integrations that you're offering to build in AI governance from or by design from scratch. I'm wondering like how, from a more kind of like procedural way of working and like kind of like offering a systematic approach to this procurement process and understanding, where different parties come in and whether you need to discuss, the terms again. How do you operate with that, and how do you kind of like build that process more rigorously? Oh, Harry, I believe you're on mute.
Yeah. So firstly, I mean, starting with the legislation, and as Carrie said, keeping track, let alone of AI procurement and processes, actually just tracking the legislation and the standards that then apply to it, which is changing every day, is a difficult process as well. In that respect, it's perhaps quite helpful to divide it into the requirements specifically applicable to those in the public sector and the private sector as well. The public sector requirements applicable to the public sector have generally been more active. We see a lot of legislation starting there. In the US, calling out examples, we have the Utah AI Policy Act, which creates an Office of Artificial Intelligence Policy, where you have to register particular AI systems and when they're used. And then similarly in Virginia, where there's now a commission, there will be a commission from the 1st of July 2024 on artificial intelligence as well, which again relates to specifically to public agencies' use of AI as well. In the private sector, there have been less successful legislative initiatives which set requirements requiring the assessment of AI uses. The most successful, though, came just today, or just the other day, in Colorado. We have a Senate Bill 24205, which requires use of reasonable care to avoid algorithmic discrimination as well, which will have to be factored into any AI procurement process. There are much more specific requirements relating to that as well. And then going forward, we know that there are going to be changes. Just today, we saw the Senate roadmap on artificial intelligence, where they want greater transparency for any which will materialize in legislative initiatives. But generally, the working group on AI outlined the need for greater transparency on the use of AI systems. This will be particularly prevalent when it comes to AI procurement processes. We already see this now in the public sector, and it will just materialize later on into the private sector. We see, for instance, the Office of Management and Budget memorandum on artificial intelligence. This set out specific requirements for federal agencies. So we now see the requirement to appoint a chief AI officer in certain government agencies, alongside the creation of an AI governance board as well. And then practically, alongside that, we expect to see this within private organizations as well. Agencies and departments, like private companies may do in the future, have to release an expanded annual inventory of use cases, identifying cases that may impact the rights and safety when it comes to use of particular AI uses. And then generally, I guess, separating out, going more into procurement and then the public and the private sector, different areas. Government procurement may differ slightly from the private sector, specifically because they have to ensure the accountability of AI systems, but they also have to ensure the democratic oversight of algorithmic decision-making as well. There are major differences in, say, the public sector compared to the private sector when it comes to the public scrutiny of AI systems. This is particularly because of the different areas in which the public sector may operate compared to, say, a single organization dealing with issues like immigration or the criminal justice system, which a lot of organizations simply won't have to deal with as well. Another difference is that in the public to the private sector is that the public organizations need to define the public benefit of using AI when assessing AI risks as well, not necessarily something that private organizations will have to do.
Thank you. Sorry, I was on mute. I can undo my little button there. But thank you for that, for the kind of mapping of the initiatives from a regulatory policy legislation perspective. One point I am curious to ask a little bit more about. That's one that you haven't delved deeper into in particular, but I know that a lot of people are curious to hear more about it. Within our organization, members, individual and corporate members are interested to hear more about it, and that's the EU AI Act. I couldn't not let that word drop. So I am happy to kind of give it to whoever wants to talk a little bit more about what the AI Act says, since it's the first global binding piece of legislation that's going to impact not only EU companies, but also those in the US, those in the UK. So it has a really broad scope. And I think it would be interesting to touch upon some of the requirements that that piece of legislation sets out and will require in terms of procurement. So I will leave it to whoever wants to, and otherwise I will start with Harry, maybe, or Harry, go ahead, whichever one of you wants to. Where are you going to?
I'll try and give a quick summary of it, and I'll try and make it applicable to a wider circumstance. I'll compare it to the NIST AI risk management framework as well, perhaps. So the EU AI Act, I'm sure everyone knows, is probably most notable in that it's a legally enforceable regulatory framework. This is what the main difference is really to, say, the NIST AI risk management framework, which is almost more of a recommendation to organizations that use AI. Within the AI Act, there are particular principles. So we have human oversight, technical robustness, privacy shouldn't be ignored, but also the transparency of AI systems as well. The requirements within the EU AI Act are really extensive, but they can generally be boiled down to perhaps three areas. We've got assessments. Assessments is going to be a word that's used a lot today. Testing and, say, documentation as well. The main thing, though, that also distinguishes the EU AI Act from perhaps other draft standards or perhaps even other legislation on AI, and again, how this relates to procurement, is that it is characterized by the classification of the risk given to AI systems. So we have different risk assignments. We have prohibited AI systems. This oftentimes encompasses AI systems which process, say, biometric data. We have high-risk AI systems, and then we have general purpose AI systems as well. There are also general requirements which apply to all AI systems. These are some I've mentioned already, so like transparency, data protection and security, and the use of AI ethically as well. And then some of these requirements apply not just based on the level of risk, but they are on the responsibility of the user. So this could be a provider, somebody that develops an AI system, a developer, a deployer, and then we have other terms like distributor and importer. These terms are now, I think, also being used more widely for other legislation. It's mirroring, say, the GDPR, and that wording within that is now being used for other legislation globally. I think I'll let Carrie or you can lead off now.
Just to follow up on that, and then maybe Carrie, you do want to maybe touch upon that, the AI Act, but I'm assuming other pieces of legislation as well, legislation or policy or regulation, non-binding or soft law instruments. I'm sure they address vendors and those that are actually buying AI differently. So could you maybe talk a little bit more about the distinction and responsibilities on that end?
Yeah, it's there's a bit of a split camp on this. So historically, particularly in the US, we have said that the deployer, so the buyer, is the responsible party, particularly in like the employment realm and the education realm and those places. What is shifting, and I think this is a contribution from the EU AI Act, is a dual liability. So we're trying to hold both parties liable, which is, I believe, the right thing to do. I mean, both parties have a responsibility when they're deploying or building AI. So when you're building AI, you have certain ethical choices you make and you bake into the system. When you're deploying it, there are ways that you can either misuse it or abuse it that could also cause harm. So I think the EU AI Act is establishing the foundation for that, and it's being picked up into state laws. The feds are on our side are a little slower on that front, but the states are picking it up. And I also think that what I'm reading in is the use of high risk. I'm not seeing too much on the prohibited systems yet, but certainly the use of high risk and classifying the systems is also being picked up, as well as like documenting, testing, and assessing. Those things are being pulled over and picked up as well in various forms. I mean, there's all kinds of politics behind the scenes about don't assess too much and don't test too much. We'll get there. But there is a harmonization starting to take place. You can feel it. It's good.
Yeah, certainly. And I'm sorry for digging deeper into these specific requirements and the nitty gritty. I could do that all day, but I will shift more to the practical side of things because we're seeing all these requirements. We're seeing ways of working in terms of procurement. Yukun, can you maybe get practical together with me and explain how you are working towards implementing some of these requirements in practice in your procurement processes at ATP, or just like general knowledge on how organizations are doing this right now?
So from a buyer perspective, we are very happy to see those EU Act or company that follow the NIST AI risk management framework, because in Canada right now, we are really hoping that Bill C-27 can pass, that we can use, especially in our contractual language. But I feel that policy and regulations, they are always behind. So from a company or to protect ourselves and our customers' perspective, we need to be ahead of those policy and regulations. So even though EU Act is not applicable to our company right now in Canada, however, we've been referring to the NIST and also EU AI Act. So one of the examples is the risk-based approach. So when we are procuring new vendor products, we'll assess the risk. And if it's a high risk AI application, will have a set of risk assessment that we'll do. While if it's just for example, just some job aid features that companies enable for us to use the tool in a better way, then it's on the lower risk end. So our process do change based on the different risk levels, because we don't want to add the same stringent is assessment on all different kinds of vendor tools. This way, we're balancing the benefit of using those vendor tools versus the risk assessment. Like Carrie said, sometimes don't test too much, but from our perspective, due diligence is a must for sure. We always ask for additional information. For example, what is your ethics risk assessment report? What is your performance monitoring report? And if it's done by a third party, or if it's following the NIST framework or EU AI Act, that will just make our life easier. But also the trend we see is companies are getting more and more matured by providing a lot of reports or third party audit report compared with maybe 6 months ago. And also with the ISO standards, ISO 42001 that's coming out, it's just going to make buyer's life easier. But as we wait for those policy regulation or standards to catch up, we're still following almost all the leading best practices that we can in the industry, in the world.
Thank you, Yukon. And I also see that we have a question from the audience that maybe just can touch upon this a little bit more, whether in these processes and your approach, you make a distinction between what Beta calls AI models and these tools. So whether you kind of distinguish based on the application of the specific AI technology in that case.
So for us, we have a risk assessment list of questions, and we send it to the vendors, and vendors either provide a report or a description, and then we verify that by meeting with them and go through all the questions. Then we will give them a risk rating. So based on the risk rating, we'll have a set of different controls that we will use. Did I capture out? I'm trying to find the question. Is it in the chat or in the Q&A?
Sorry, I should have noted that more specifically. It is in the chat, please. But if you want to specify more what you mean, then maybe you can answer either in the chat, or I'll ask the question again later on.
Yeah, so we address it. So I'm the vice chair on IEEE. There's a international standard we're working on, and for AI procurement. And just this is me speaking, not on behalf of IEEE. But I can tell you that we don't necessarily distinguish. But what we do suggest is that your procurement staff needs to understand what the AI supply chain is, because you need to ask deeper questions. So the tool is just the user interface, really. It's going to sit on top of some kind of a model. And so you need to understand who's involved in that supply chain and you need the transparency, because at some point you got to find out what was in that model, what was it trained on, is it fit for purpose? Is it going to do the things you need it to do? And really what you're trying to get to is what kind of ethical debt are they handing over to you to deal with? That's really at the end of the day, that's what you're trying to figure out. And then are you willing to accept that? And whatever it is, can you mitigate it even further to create a safe environment for whoever you're deploying this to? So I don't know that there's a necessary to distinguish. You still have to know what's going on in the whole supply chain of AI when you buy it.
I agree. I will add a bit, Hadassah. Now I understand the question better as Carrie answered it. I think like Carrie said, it's important to open the hood and see what's inside. So the risk assessment that I mentioned is not a simple form that you send to the vendor, let them fill out, and then you review it. It's more of an interactive approach that you do your due diligence and understand what's in that tool. What is the supporting model behind it? And will that trigger different risks for that model? And for our company, we have model risk management that will specifically look at the model risks. So it really depends on what is supporting the tool behind the scene. And I want to emphasize the interaction between buyers and vendors to truly know what they are doing and also how they're using your data. This data governance is one of the most important pieces in our whole risk management system. Is how are they using your data, especially in the LLM world. That is your data that you put into the LLM system or product. Are they going to use your data to retrain the model? Or so those can be some examples. I don't want to talk to the details just yet. In case, Hadassah, you have other questions, I'll hand it back to you, Hadassah.
Oh, thank you for that explanation. And it just comes to show that the importance of that concept of transparency and implementing it in practice. But I do wonder, considering the fact that a lot of this information is proprietary information, and a lot of companies developing these models and then building the tools on top of that, they kind of keep this information a lot of times behind closed doors. So looking at it more from a practical perspective, when you're actually trying to get this information, how do you achieve that transparency? And what are the challenges that you'll be facing in achieving that?
Yeah, there are a lot of challenges. I can't deny that. It still goes back to the interactiveness that we apply. There are a lot of companies, when they provide reports, they're not as mature. So the maturity level are so different across different vendors. For those that can provide a third-party audit report, it's very clear for us to know what they are doing in this model, how they're using our data. For those that can't support those, we will meet with their actual developers or data scientists or the real technical person that we can talk. And we have a list of questions that if they don't have a standard report, then we ask this list of questions so we can understand what they are doing from our own perspective rather than rely on a third-party report. Of course, we hope that there can be a standard report that they just provide us, but it's not realistic right now, as of right now. I do see the maturity is going up, which is favorable for us. That's why I said in the beginning that there are still a lot of gaps in procurement field, and we're still navigating it, try to mature ourselves as well.
Yes, definitely. And I think the same applies to the regulatory scene, but what we were discussing just before. Harry, thanks for the overview of what's going on in this space. And then, Carrie, you mentioned that you're working on standardization. I'm guessing to fill in part of those gaps that we're seeing from the real regulatory point of view, the perspective of providing organizations with guidance. Can you maybe touch more upon those gaps from a regulatory perspective and where we will be shifting in terms of filling in those gaps as we move forward?
So we're right on top of what the issue is, the visibility and the transparency and the trust in what someone's telling you about their system. That really is one of the biggest gaps, because there is, I don't know if you've heard of this little thing called lobbying. They're big, and they're kind of holding us back from getting to that information. And so from a regulatory perspective, what we want to see is that we allow for some level of attestations, like you attest, you do your own self-assessment, maybe on one end of the spectrum, up to and including a independent, qualified third party, rigorous, I wouldn't call it an assessment, it's more of an audit. It's a pass-fail situation. That would be at the other end of the spectrum. And it depends on the type of system you're running. I mean, if you're running a system that's determining welfare benefits for underrepresented individuals, we need a full-scale audit performed on that system. No stone unturned. Let's make sure that system is performing at its peak. If it's a lower end system, maybe it's a chatbot to determine, high school dress code in a county. Okay, I can probably deal with an attestation on that. So we need to find a level of reasonableness, but that absolutely is one of the biggest gaps, that and data privacy, which, we have the state level hodgepodge tapestry of activity going on that we can't seem to figure out. But I mean, even GDPR has been, it's good. It's good, but it's not perfect,
I love the positive notes. But I do agree. I think that we're way ahead of that. We passed that discussion on privacy and data protections when it was still a hype, and it was all, this is some area that we need to regulate, but we're still dealing with those very issues, despite the fact that the GDPR is already over 5 years old. And we're still facing similar questions, just in a different context. And I think people and practitioners and organizations sometimes tend to forget that AI is, it's here. We're trying to regulate it, but we're still relying on those older frameworks and way before that as well. You spoke about transparency. We've been focusing on that. I know that one point in achieving transparency is collaboration. It was mentioned at the start of this panel, and I want to touch upon that again. I read a really interesting blog post by OneTrust last week on bringing the right people to the table. So Harry, no better person to ask more about this concept of collaboration, bring the right people to the table than asking you. Can you touch more on that topic?
Absolutely. And thank you for the call out on the article. So yeah, transparency and collaboration, we've talked a lot about transparency today, goes hand in hand together with collaboration. So as we've mentioned, it's both a legal requirement in some jurisdictions. It will be in the EU under the AI Act. It already is or will be in certain US areas. So again, New York, local law 144, and then soon in Colorado as well. But it's also recommended more widely. So again, in the US, we have the recommendation for transparency under the NIST AI risk management framework as well. Thinking of collaboration, though, perhaps the best way for transparency materialize at the procurement stage is through contractual requirements or any service level agreement that an organization has with a vendor. It's not just useful, but necessary and recommended, for procured AI tools to outline what the responsibilities are going to be. Doing this not just, generally, but on a case-by-case basis, particularly when there is a high risk in the deployment case. It's particularly important because organizations that are deploying AI tools from a vendor are dependent on those vendors for understanding the capabilities or the efficacy of that particular AI system. And I know we've talked today about particular terminology that's common in certain legislation and standards. So the idea of providers or developers who create basically different AI systems, and then deployers, organizations who may actually use an AI system. It's important to define the responsibilities of the named parties within contracts. It's particularly important, again, where the contracting vendor, for instance, may use an AI model already developed by a third party, but is then used to create a proprietary AI system as well. So really to define the specific ideas. This idea of defining responsibilities also goes with the testing requirements of an AI system at the procurement stage, making sure you are defining what the expected outcome of an AI system is. Alongside that, in terms of just simply being transparent, it's important to report, again, like a lot of organizations do when it comes to, say, privacy or data security issues, any identified AI harms by a vendor, alongside perhaps any incidents as well. And then more generally, the need for transparency and collaboration between a vendor and organization is necessary because, something I've touched on already, there's a general asymmetry between the information that's held by a provider, developer, a vendor, and an organization, a deployer as well. So organizations will want to know the information that's held by vendors. They'll want to know, for instance, the intended or even the unintended purposes of an AI system, how the AI system was trained, what data it was trained on, whether the AI system was assessed for, say, a discriminatory bias, again, something we've talked about already, and then actually what the AI system is intended to be deployed for. This final point is particularly important, the idea of collaboration. It will require cooperation and a level of transparency between providers. Fine, I guess leave time for everyone else to speak. Going back to some legislative examples, they've actually provided a great example as to the level of transparency and the level of collaboration that there should be perhaps between organizations and vendors. Going back to Colorado, again, quite a unique US example of a US state law relating to AI in the private sector. We'll know now that organizations, they need to know a reasonably foreseeable use and the known for any known harms, any inappropriate uses of high-risk AI systems. Organizations should receive high-level summaries of the type of data used to train high-risk AI systems, any limitations of the AI systems, again, that purpose of the AI system, something I've talked about before, what are the intended benefits of the AI system as well, alongside a whole other range of information.
Yeah, thank you for that, elaboration on this concept of collaboration, how that feeds into transparency. All these requirements bring up a topic in my mind, which we have touched upon throughout this entire session, which is assessments. And Carrie, I know that you that in preparation of this this panel discussion, we touched upon that as well. We spoke about, and now as well, the need for an assessment done within an organization as a way of saying, we have managed to comply with the objectives of existing regulatory frameworks. But you also have the third party, more stringent version of ensuring that an outside party can look into the organization, understand whether or not requirements are met. At the Responsible AI Institute, we also work hard on topics like these. We are building our own tools, our own assessments to ensure that requirements within existing regulatory frameworks and the upcoming ones are also met. One of which is our organizational maturity assessment. We have a system level assessment, and then we also have, of course, the responsible supplier assessment that we work on. And in all this, what we're trying to do is understand, we can use it as a roadmap. We can use it as a way to assess gaps within your ways of working. And then finally, you can also move this onwards towards a third-party attestation, certification scheme, whatever you need to pull it. Can we talk more about that? I know we're almost out of time and I want to wrap up in a bow, but I can't leave it and not have that discussion in a little bit more depth to understand why you would opt for one or the other.
Well, in my opinion, the more the better. Yeah, your whole mission as a vendor right now is to distinguish yourself as an upstanding provider, as an upstanding citizen. There are a lot of, I'm a part of this Facebook group, and it's like a ChatGPT uses Facebook group. Anyway, I saw the other day someone posts in there, hey, my college teacher asked me to do a program that does X, Y, and Z. Do you have any ideas of how I can do this? And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is such a low barrier to entry environment that anybody really can produce a product and take it to market and commercialize it, and with no guardrails whatsoever. That's where we're at. So anytime you can do any kind of assessment, that's highly recommended. The better assessments are those that can come from outside, that are an objective third party, even if you have no intentions of sharing that with anyone, to just have that assessment. It's kind of like when you go to sell your house and you get the real estate agent to come through and be like, there's a crack there, that paint's gross. Like, just get that going. We're early days still. This is part of the maturity. And so I love what the Responsible AI Institute has done, because you have a ton of really, really smart people that are diverse. They're coming from a lot of diverse backgrounds. And so what I've witnessed in your group is the rigor of the challenge of like, well, we should have this type of a question in the assessment. Yeah, that's great, except for you can't be binary. It has to be fated, and you have to have these considerations. So a lot of stuff's been baked into what you guys have already done. And so there are a lot of ways to do assessment, but I always prefer a third party, because they probably put lots of people together, lots of big brains together, and there's some rigor to it. That's just me.
Yeah, definitely agree. It's challenging, but in a good way, to get another party involved, and to ensure that you're aligned also in terms of what you're assessing when you're creating this framework, and then when you're actually implementing it in an assessment procedure. But yeah, it's I think very important as well. And we as an organization are open to and committed to working with other organizations that are trying to understand these intricacies and how to address these challenges. So looking forward to that, continuing that journey. Now, really moving to the wrap up. I want to give all of you the mic again and share just some closing thoughts, some actionable steps, I would say, that the audience of this panel can take with them in terms of, well, understanding, where do I now start? I know we've discussed it all in depth during this panel session, but maybe just in a couple of points, what you could share, well, what to take home from this panel session. I'll start with you, Yukon.
There are a lot of thoughts, but I think the most useful one for our company is to organize that multidisciplinary, like Carrie said, diverse group of people that's representing ethics, risk, security, data governance. I think, and a few more. I'm just naming a few. I think that's important for you to first work as a group, learn about the potential risks of using AI in different tools. And you all work together and collaborate and review those vendors together. And each of you can provide a different view. And this group of people are very versatile, because they can adjust to different kinds of vendors' requirements. And based on your own team's requirements, you can evaluate those vendors. Regardless, they have a third-party report. Like Carrie said, of course, we want a third-party report. But the most important thing is we ourselves know the risks. We know what we are looking for. I see that's the most foundational piece for us to evaluate the vendors.
Thank you, Yukon. And then heading on to you, Harry. What points would you like to give the audience?
I won't try to echo the same point again, but yeah, I think the idea of recruiting from a range of different areas, something, that I touched on at the very beginning, that there's almost a skill shortage when it comes to AI and AI procurement. You're going to want to leverage as many different areas as you can. It won't just be a case of a series of AI professionals. You're going to need people from, as you can just said, from privacy, from data governance, from data security, ethics, to form a procurement team or to bolster one if you already have one. I guess more practically, again, some of the issues that I mentioned earlier, looking at, say, those contractual requirements to facilitate transparency, which will probably soon be legislative requirements as well, because having a transparent relationship with the vendor is something also that the vendors, that we've talked about, something that vendors should actively want to seek to distinguish themselves within the market. it's going to be transparency is something that you want to facilitate that relationship, both at the procurement stage, but throughout the AI life cycle as well.
Yeah, thanks for those takeaways. I know it's a difficult question to end a session with because we're all quite aligned in our thoughts. But I still want to give you the mic as well, Carrie, to well, finish up and wrap up the session.
Yeah, so we have not talked about agent-based AI, agentic AI. And I bring this up because I feel like it's just right around the corner. And so if we think dealing with ChatGPT has been challenging, we haven't seen anything yet. And it really is. It's right around the corner. And so all the interrogation we do on an LLM is going to be tenfold when we get to an agent-based AI. And they're coming, knocking on our door soon. And so I bring this up because we know that legislation is not keeping up with technology. It's trailing. And I said at the top, procurement is the cornerstone, one of the cornerstones of responsible AI governance. Procurement is the party that says the bad stuff can come in or the bad stuff that stays out. Unless you have shadow IT, then that's a whole different story. But procurement is that's your gate, right? And so we have to double down with what we're doing with procurement, which means we need to upskill our procurement staffs. We need to make sure our teams, like Harry was just saying, we have to have the right team in place, but we also need them to come up to the next level of understanding of what AI supply chain is. We need them to stay on top of, okay, what is agentic AI? What are those problems that could be coming at us? They need to stay ahead of that because the legislators can't keep up as fast as they need to. It's going to be procurement that keeps your company safe. So that's my closer remark.
Thank you very much. So in a nutshell, we need collaboration, stakeholder engagement, transparency, and coming back to what you also mentioned, Carrie, at the beginning, we need to know what we're working with, who we're working with, and where we're going. So with that, I want to thank you, Carrie, Harry, and Yukon for joining me on this panel, for joining us in this session. Thanks to the audience also for joining. And with that, I will wrap up. And feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any questions. Thanks.